Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Simon. For this second series, we want to follow up on. It feels like it's very low. Is it okay, the volume in the room?
It's good.
Okay, it just feels very low when you're standing here. So we wanted to follow up and expand a little bit on series 1. And indeed, series 3 will also expand on series 2 to some extent. In the first 4 lectures that was organized by Ross Gray, the theme, of course, was on ecological stewardship. And we thought it would be a good idea to expand on that into this notion of the planetary, as seen as opposition to the global and globalization. And I'll just say a few words about why we think that. But then also through the notion of governance, and with a specific focus on governance within the art world and how that might affect the rest of the world. So without a separation between how the art world does worlding and how the business world does worlding, but rather just look at how artistic and also curatorial practices can make us think about governance and how to be governed, how hard, how soft, how future-orientated, how historically orientated, that we can contribute to, and particularly in the notion, in the age of the planetary. And what is the planetary age? There are many starting points for that, but one would certainly be the early 1970s and the publication of something called the Whole Earth Catalog, which was the first time that we all could see images of the globe from, let's say, from the outside and as an actual globe. So it was a different form of imagination that's in a way close to artistic imagination. But this was at a moment of optimism, when also the architect and futurist Buckminster Fuller wrote a famous book called Operator's Manual for Spaceship Earth, which came out at the same time, and sort of had this same idea that if we look at the Earth as a globe, we can see it as communal, and we can see it as a spaceship that we can govern together through progress and technology, so that the modernization that's implied in technology will lead to rational decisions and a rational understanding of our future that perhaps could be seen as a precursor to ecology, but at the same time certainly came at a moment when we were still not conscious of the dependency, and I would say abusive dependency we have on fossil fuels, which of course we were to discover only a few years later in 1973 and the first oil crisis. So that's sort of one of the starting points for looking at the planetary, but you can also see that it immediately runs into the moment of crisis, and that's indeed what we will turn to in series 3, which will look at this idea of a plurality of crises that might even be ungovernable. But for now, we'll try and look at modes of governance that considers a planetary scale. And this has, of course, let's say, many starting points. Today we'll talk mostly about the commons, and I'll introduce Mao in a minute. But just to say that the notion of the planetary as in opposition to the global has to do with globalization as a term that, for better or for worse, has not mainly cultural connotations, although it has those too, but mainly as part of an economic program of neoliberalism and deregulation, and the kind of disparity that has actually created economically on a global scale. So therefore, perhaps by thinking of the planetary, we can rethink the notion of what it means to be grounded after globalization. This is something that particularly the late sociologist and philosopher Bruno Latour has written about. He passed away just recently. But in one of his many books called Down to Earth, he actually writes about globalization as having a progressive element culturally and a regressive element economically. And that it was often seen as one of the problems or issues that dominated the contemporary, together with the growing inequality in the world, and finally a third aspect that he dates to the election of Donald Trump in the United States and the implementation of Brexit in the UK, which he says are really about climate denial. The moment when the ruling elite says there's no reason for us to pretend that the world is shared, our future has nothing to do with your future, our countries do not care about the rest, and the consequences for the rest. Indeed, as another American president once formulated it, our way of life is not negotiable. And so it's this idea that we don't even pretend that we're thinking that we live in a common world, on a globe together, but rather that we're in some sort of competition where it will be the survival of some to the detriment of others. And Latour claims in this book, Down to Earth, that came out in 2017, that it's really the advent of climate change and the crisis it brings and the consciousness it brings that is the background for all of these tendencies. Economic deregulation and growing inequality are both expressions of this idea that we do not share the planet and that we cannot share the planet. We're in competition, there's scarcity, so we're in competition. Now, I think this kind of tripartition actually reminded me of another late author, also sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, whom he does not quote in his book, which I think is a major oversight, but okay. See, we always try to tell you, you have to quote your sources. But he wrote a text that I still find inspirational and that I think we can actually revisit in the current moment, called Times of Interregnum, exactly 10 years ago. And he passed away also about 5 years ago. And he says that what will, the interregnum he defines through Anthony Gramsci as the period of time when the old regime has fallen apart, our old worldviews and structures are crumbling, but we haven't yet found new ones to replace them with. So that's what he calls the time of interregnum. And he says the outcome of this interregnum will be decided by three things. And I think actually through the tour we can sync them together, and hopefully we can do that in this lecture series. So he says, first of all, that there is the issue of institutional disparity. Secondly, the future of the migrants. And thirdly, the endurability of the planet. I'll take them in reverse order because I think the last two are intuitively understandable. Endurability of the planet, yes, the way we act and react to climate change, and not the way that our leaders just did, will decide the outcome of the current malaise. Right? So this has to do, of course, with ecology and climate change and sustainability. Secondly, the future of the migrants. We're going through a global crisis of migration that will only become worse as it's tied to climate change and more parts of the world will become inhabitable. Right? So again, the idea that we can separate the future into our future and their future through militaristic zones is the kind of aggressive denial. But the planetary response, again, going back to Latour rather than Bauman himself, will be to say, how do we live together with people with whom we think we have nothing in common except the fact that none of us have solid ground to stand on anymore. Neither those in the north or in the rich countries, nor those in the global south where the soil is literally burning. But both of these issues are, of course, connected to the third one, which is the one that really has to do with governance, which is institutional disparity. What kind of institutions should we construct, deconstruct, or reconstruct in order to deal with these issues? Right? We all feel, probably even here, thinking of the relationship anyway between staff and our senior management team, that there's a disparity between what we want and how the institution is governed. Probably feel that on the political level in this country with the successive strange leaders of the Tory party, one by one, taking place in Downing Street and then leaving, but without any change. So on the one hand, everything changes, and at the other hand, everything seems to stay the same. And maybe we feel a certain fatigue with, what does it matter what we vote for? Does it matter that we put trust in institutions? Look at the inability of politicians to react at the Cairo summit, right? Or to react properly or radically. There is a kind of slowness, there's a disparity in the institutions that we have, and there seems to be a difficulty in thinking of what institutions could replace them and how they could replace the stale ones fast enough. So today in the first lecture, we'll try and discuss this through the Commons, and this will be a lecture from Massimiliano Mollona, who used to be here at Goldsmiths until 2 years ago in the anthropology department. He's now teaching at the University of Bologna. But you also run your own para-institutions, if I can call them so. One of them is the Institute of Radical Imagination, which hopefully we can talk about a little bit today. And you have published a book called Art Commons that you'll be referring to. Now, in terms of the Commons and the relationship to education, I will give the word to Mao with this send-off. There is an interesting, of course, a moment of huge changes in education that happened very quickly was 1968, and someone who stood on the sidelines was the German, at that time based in America, philosopher Hannah Arendt, who wasn't involved in '68 at all, as far as I know. But she actually wrote a text on education, and I'll just paraphrase, but her idea about education is that this is the place for renewal. So the role of education is not to teach students knowledge, not to give them knowledge, not to teach them what we know, but rather to give them the tools to remake the world, to create something new. So to not think the way that their tutors have been thinking, to not think the way that the preceding generations, but rather give them the tools not to follow us, but to undertake something new, something unforeseen. And as she says, prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world. So not just renewing the world, but the world as common. So over to you, Mao.
Okay, so, well, thank you, Suhail and Simon, for the invitation. And to be back here after 2 years seems to be back in a kind of really different place, although it's obviously the same. I've been teaching here for 20 years, and I moved to Bologna a couple of years ago, partly because the organization of Goldsmiths was becoming so crazy that I really needed to leave. One of the last thing I remember about Goldsmiths was proposing to the dean to turn Goldsmiths into a commons, and obviously they laughed at me. But anyway, since then my interest in commons continued. My notion of the planetary, as I developed in this watercolor, for me was inspired by Trotsky, who talked about the planetary in his book on the Russian Revolution. And his notion of the planetary was really about a world that was in continuous transformation and about a communist revolution that could not happen in Russia only, and that in order to succeed, to happen on a planetary level. So he was describing this world that was totally interconnected. He was describing a Russia that was completely under the domination of the Western powers, of European powers. And because of this imperial domination, Russia being a totally aristocratic and unequal nation, in which a very strong proletariat, let's say marginal proletariat, developed. But this proletariat, in order to succeed, had to have the support also of the proletariat of the Europe, of the global North. So here there is already an idea that planetary politics is about a world in continuous transformation, a world in commons, and the politics that has to necessarily operate through international solidarity. So my interest really has always been about the relationship with art and political economy, and especially art and commons. And I want to start with an anecdote, as usually you do. And it starts really with an article that I read on the New Yorker. It was about survivalism. and was about all these high-tech entrepreneurs that in the 2000s started to panic about the end of the world and started to buy land in Australia and New Zealand and started to develop really bunkers where they could hide in case of planetary disruption. What they were worried about especially was the collapse of the state. They were noticing that the states across Europe and across US are really collapsing, and that was the time in which, let's say, the global financial crisis in 2008 had just happened, and there was this series of global movements that were circulating across the world. These bunkers had underground rooms that were fitted with these windows that gave an impression of, naturalistic impression. This particularly is a bunker was developed in the Wichita Desert, and there are 12 apartments. Each of them was bought for £3 million. And we can live off the grid for 5 years, and it could live basically forever. If it's connected to electricity. And obviously one of the things that preoccupied the developers was that there were really strict social rules, because there was a high chance that actually social conflict and inside the bunker might happen, and that would have been a real nightmare. And when I read that article was 2016, when I really had just started to be director of the Athens Biennale. And going to Athens, I was experiencing another collapse of the state, in the sense that Athens at that time and Greece at that time were being pushed by the European Troika to really serious austerity measures. And as a consequence, the state was cutting down on everything. The state was really collapsing because the main thing they was trying to do was paying back debts to Europe. And at that time, because of the collapse of the state, the schools, the public schools were closed, the public GPs were closed, and the Solidarity for All movements and other forms, and other organizations started to provide these services that the state was not providing anymore. And Athens particularly was completely self-managed by both solidarity organization, by squads, by occupation, and by basically commons. And so that's when I was inspired to actually turn the Athens Biennale into a common, into a big commons, into, let's say, socialize this format of the Biennale, this institution of the Biennale that we know is highly problematic. So just giving a couple of definitions, let's say that in this book, Art Commons, I try to define what I mean for capitalism, what I mean for art, and I take very much an anthropological perspective. And so basically I define as capitalism as a form of enclosure, of artifacts, of objects, of actions, of thoughts, of all these kind of forms of life that normally are in movement. So I define capitalism as a form of enclosure. And it's an enclosure that naturalizes what is inside, but also devalues what is inside by creating this principle of scarcity. So because things started to be enclosed, frozen, in this kind of artificial institution of property, these things also start to be quantifiable. And to be quantified, they also lose the quality, they lose the characteristic, which is obviously its relational characteristic, its characteristic of being able to transform and to change. So that's my definition of capitalism. And my definition of commons is about, let's say, the cracks and the openings within this enclosure that allow life to flow again, to come back into circulation, to be shared and socialized. And in terms of art, I defined also art as a very, let's say, very similar to capitalism, as using the same negative logic or logic of speculation. Art is also a mechanism that encloses objects, encloses artifacts in museums, in institutional spaces, and in so doing really devalues them, devalues human action by giving them a market value. Boris Groys talks a little bit about this in his book In the Flow, in which describes this trade-off between a world in flow, a world in transformation, and the world of art that capture, ossifies and let's say, blocks life. So, of course, I'm also interested in the tradition of common or communism that developed in contemporary art, in Western contemporary art, and I'm also interested in the role of a revolutionary avant-garde and the issue really of contemporary art, or let's say socially or politically engaged art, is how you get rid of these enclosures. And one of the propositions, obviously, of Malevich was to get rid of the institution of the museum, to get rid of a mechanism of representation, of identification that art and the art world was providing. And then there is obviously this great utopia of the cosmist, and not quite the planetary, but the cosmic, which means that imagining the museum, as Nikolai Fedorov was looking at it, the museum of the future, as a museum that is not disconnected from life, but is completely in tune with the flowing of life. Again, here the issue was to get rid of any kind of artifacts or object that could be chained or imprisoned, of any kind of representative mechanism of identification, and to create a space where humanity could actually evolve, humanity could find mechanism of evolution. And of course, the cosmists were quite weird in the sense they were also trying to look at a form of resuscitation, of eternal life, but looking also at this idea of intergenerational solidarity. So they were looking also at relationship between the dead and the living as a form of, let's say, solidarity across generation. The time of, let's say, utopian communism or communism in art led to pretty crazy utopia, like flying cities, where people could live in this kind of capsule. And as maybe Simon was saying, you know, about the 1970s, this was also a moment in which people were looking at the world from afar and thinking how cities and institutions particularly could be rendered fluid. These were pods that could go under the water, flying, and then reconvene this kind of circular way. But also, let's say that this idea of the Museum of the Future was also linked to very grounded dematerialization of the museum, like the agitprop van, which was basically a van that went around in the cities, and it could be turned into a theater, it could be turned into a cinema, it could be turned into a performance space, into a library. So there was this idea that already that the museum, that the art space was had to be deinstitutionalized, to be let's say render deconstructed really, and render invisible and dispersed in society. So let's say that I want to define first, before I go on, I want to define the notion of commons, because there are a lot of conversation, there are a lot of misunderstanding about what a commons is. So the term commons can signify three things. First, it could signify a pool of natural or intellectual resources. Secondly, it could signify a community of people that has reciprocal and sharing relationship. And third, it could signify the act of working together towards the reproduction of the community. So it could be a material resource, it could be a community, or it could be a form of action. And in reality, you can have real commons only when you have these three forms together, in the sense that you cannot have a sharing of material resources if you don't have also a methodology through which you have to reproduce, let's say, horizontal social relationship. So commons is also a commitment to a form of life and a form of reproduction of life that is different to a form of living, let's say, otherwise. And also, as Elinor Armstrong, the Nobel Prize, showed in the 1990s, commons are not resources that are shared by everybody, that can be appropriated by everybody, but are resources that are heavily regulated. And there are resources that have a mechanism, for instance, of conflict resolution, have a mechanism of self-management, of division of labor. And mainly commons are places where people who are closer to the resources, people who depend more from these resources, and people who know how to use them better, basically manage them. And there is an automatic mechanism of empowerment of these communities that are closer to commons. So in spatial, let's say in political terms, commons are neither public nor private. And of course, we know that this distinction between public and private is also problematic. We imagine the public as being the space of the state and the private as being the space of the market. But of course, these two spaces are completely connected in the sense that the space of the state is also the space that systematically reproduces the interest of the market. But the commons came out precisely because it understood that there is no alternative, there is no possibility of a public space that is entirely public, and of a private space, obviously, that is entirely private, and that the two things reflect each other. And so the emergence of the common is really the emergence of a criticism of this modernist way of thinking about political institutions. And as I will show later, the first form of commoning in art came out precisely in the 1970s, when there was this kind of awareness that the state and the market were two sides of the same coin. So the notion of commons as a scarce resource is also problematic in decolonial terms. There are a lot of, let's say, decolonial critique to the notion of commons as mastery in common of resources. And also there is an important difference between commons which are enclosures and commons that are continuously evolving. So commons cannot be really community that are enclosed. Commons are worlds in movements, Stavros Stavridis says, are, let's say, enclosure that are continually opening up, are forms that opens up and reclose again. And whenever you have occupation, for instance, let's say urban occupation, where communities stay the same, these urban occupations are destined to die out. And so that is one of the problems of urban commons, is that they have to open up to the dynamics of the city. But we'll talk there a little bit later. And the other issue that from anthropology is that commons really are not, let's say, Western inventions or let's say, late inventions, but commons and communism are the way most societies have been living outside capitalism. And that colonial capitalism is a systematic attempt to reduce commons to enclosure, to re-enclose common resources. And the systematic attempt has always happened, for many, many centuries, but there is always a tension between commons and enclosures. The other important thing that I was saying before is that commons cannot exist in total autonomy. And so there is this notion of, this idea of temporary autonomous zone, for instance, from, anarchic thinking. And as, the late David Graeber showed very well, autonomous zones have to live and coexist with states. And so the other challenge is how do you create autonomous zones within states? But let's go now to the relationship between commons and art. And let's say that I start with 1970s precisely to pick up that moment that Simon highlighted, which is a moment in which artists started to realize that there was a problem in public art, and also that obviously a huge market for art was developing, that art was becoming a big business. And so the first, let's say, movements of the common, the first form of commoning was really the artist-run spaces in the 1970s, the so-called independent art spaces. And these were spaces that basically were openly refusing both public art and the art market. They closed themselves in these forms of self-managed autonomous communities in which artists would manage directly their own businesses, but also there was a collective form of art management. This art space, this is the kitchen, that is a historical space in New York, where, from Baldassarre to Mapplethorpe to Acconci, they were all developing this, let's say, setup of autonomous spaces. So obviously, it was a time when artists were looking at trade unions, were looking at the labor movements, and they were understanding that there were forms of coming together that were very effective, but they were also understanding that these kind of mass movements of the proletariat, these mass movements of labor organization, were somehow being co-opted in the logic of the state. And so artist-run spaces are spaces that really refuse this idea of mass politics, of class politics, and started to develop this kind of horizontal relationship, this relationship of, let's say, teamwork, this relationship of de-skilling and creating, let's say, managerial labor between them. And so this idea of really of, let's say, creativity in the art world, of self-management, started to become very central. And as Boltanski and Capello also show, this moment of artist-run spaces is also a moment in which the sort of critique of the art world towards the institution of society start to create a different kinds of dominant capitalism, a different kind of capitalism based on horizontality, on creativity, on de-skilling and reskilling, on multi-skilling. And so this kind of horizontalism started to be developed in the art world, in these circles of artist-run spaces, independent movements, and also, obviously, in the kind of anarchist middle-class circles, that they start to refuse, the rationality of the state, they start to refuse also the market, and start to drop out in this social space. There is an autonomous space. So we can see that this notion of, let's say, the commons in the 1970s was really problematic because it was reworked by basically an elite of white middle-class artists or white middle-class, let's say, dropouts, who then started to develop a totally different hegemonic order. Let's say that that was the moment in which also this kind of critique of corporate capitalism coincided with huge changes in economy. There was the oil shock in 1973. The economy completely collapsed. Globalization started to have a big tension also in relationship to the decolonial movements that were starting to emerge in the global south. So corporations couldn't really anymore, let's say, base their profits on this massive scale. They have to descale to render production flexible. And so this kind of dispersion, institutional dispersion that was happening in capitalism was mirrored and perhaps even, let's say, anticipated by the institutional dispersion that were happening in the art world. The other movements that was very slowly starting from performance art was the movements of relational art. The fact that artists started to look at politics not so much as an issue of class confrontation or economic confrontation, but as an issue of experience. An issue of this, obviously, is coming quite late in the 1990s. But let's say that from performance art, from the initial experiment of performance art, they were very political, were about, let's say, confront or read the forces of capitalism through the body. This early form of performance art led to a kind of rereading of politics through these lines of the experience, through the lines of leisure, to the lines of let's say, this community that came together in a very impermanent way. So relational art was about to produce not so much art, but produce social relations, and to produce social relations that were very impermanent. So again, the notions of relational art, as then was much later articulated by Nicolas Bourriot, was that the value was not to be found in capitalism, but had to be found at the margin of capitalism, outside capitalism, on the verge, right outside, where there was this impermanent moment of people coming together, this impermanent moment of leisure, this impermanent moment of communities that stay together without really wanting to stay together for too long, this kind of impermanence. Of course, there are a number of problems with this. One of them is that Bourriot doesn't recognize any kind of politics at all, not only class politics, but even any kind of black politics or gender politics. So the formulation of relational art is totally apolitical, but points to another moment in which actually artists try to form this utopia outside capitalism. It's only in the, let's say, the kind of the spiraling out of relational art. Let's say they they spiral out in different forms of curating, in which, let's say, the moment of reciprocity, of gift-giving, this kind of economy of exchange and mutuality becomes at the center, start to go at the center of really the framework of the curators. So here we have first Jessica Morgan that makes this big exhibition called Commonwealth. There is supposedly a big form of exchange between the public and the artist. The whole exhibition is framed in terms of gift-giving. And again, here the issue is that there was that the museum was a framework through which mechanism of exchange between the public and the author and the artist were set in place, set in motion. And of course, again, here we can see how this kind of relational art also coincides with this phase of capitalism where value is not anymore on what we produce, but is how we consume. And also value is in the experience, so in the experience economy, which a lot of artists actually slowly understood that experience economy, that the service economy is an area of struggle. And that's what later on a lot of artists did. You know, this kind of occupational art is really about artists moving in the space where capitalism was really reproducing its value. So now, let's say in the 1990s, people start to understand that actually commons are systematically captured by capitalism. Every time we set up a mechanism of leisure or coming together, capitalism really thrives on that. And so again, in a way, these forms of, let's say, relational art really prefigure a kind of immaterial capitalism that thrives on free time, that thrives on leisure, that thrives on intellectual labor. And so that's the second moment in which artists start to actually, realize that actually they have to struggle not outside capitalism. There is no possibility of exiting capitalism. They have to struggle inside capitalism. And so there are a lot of forms of, let's say, commons that start to confront directly capitalism. And I'm going to focus especially on urban commons and on the kind of artist practices that really are focused on struggles in the city. Because one of the main, let's say, institutional changes of capitalism in Europe was that actually cities, deindustrialized cities, had to rely on culture, on art, and on land, on rent seeking in order to survive. So the big shift in European, let's say, economies and institutions is that actually municipalities start to be really conveyor belts of capitalism. And the cities, the public, start to be completely eroded because the only way for a municipality to survive is through rent seeking. And so this is a moment of a series of art strategies that are aimed at, let's say, socialize urban spaces. This is a project that you probably know. It's Reclos project row houses, which was let's say, an attempt to set up an NGO that would control an area of Houston that was completely, let's say, derelict, run down. But especially there was related to these gunshot houses that were historically houses that were used during the plantation times. So they were actually containers of plantation workers, very long and dark. And so Reclos decided to socialize these houses and to create an NGO that would, let's say, prevent the area from being gentrified, but also they would, let's say, be targeted to low-income black families. This project had many characteristics, it started a trend that then T.S. Gates and various other artists embraced. So the idea of the artist as an entrepreneur, as an artist who kind of occupies the mechanism of capitalism, the mechanism of planning, and they do so using the same basically weapons of capitalism and urban planning, and creating these economies that are kind of circular economies. Of course, one of the problems is that these projects are quite, let's say, self-defeating, at least conceptually, because they imply to getting totally involved in the planning logic and in the economic logic of the various municipalities. This is the famous fiction park in Hamburg. But let's say that I want to kind of emphasize this moment also in the 1990s of shift from, let's say, relational art to participatory art. And participatory art was a different kind of understanding of communities or artist communities or artist interventions, and was let's say, a much more politically oriented kind of intervention, let's say institutional intervention. Again, here the issue was that artists had to, let's say, operate as outside the museum, but also they started to embrace really the modus operandi and the logic of activists. And the precursor was Susan Lacy, who obviously used a lot the kind of feminist circle, these kind of gatherings, feminist gatherings, and also started to develop this kind of durational project. This Auckland project was a 10 years long project in which she worked continuously with a low-income community of Auckland. And the idea was that to this kind of new educational structure, she would create, also co-create with the community, different pedagogical modules, which would allow the community to actually become autonomous, especially the youth of the community. So there was a module of, let's say, personal safety, martial arts, video literacy, law. So this idea of participatory art obviously is quite problematic from various points of view, and Claire Bishop is one of the critics who mostly supported this idea of participatory art. And actually for Claire Bishop, I think it's interesting to let's say, talk about her because she thought about yet another idea of the common, so yet another idea of the public. And for her, the public was not a public that was a homogeneous, where people would understand each other in harmony, as for relational art, but in fact was an agonistic space, was a space of confrontation. And for her, the best artists were artists who, highlighted this kind of the conflictual role of art and the impossibility of art of creating social harmony, but actually the implication of artists, that being implicated of artists in the capitalist system. Let's say that I want to now pass the shift into this moment in which, let's say, that I was describing before, in 2008, when all these strategies of relational art or participatory art start to crumble in presence of actually these big changes in the political scene, and especially these movements of occupation of cities that started in 2010, really from the strong emergence of strong crisis in Greece, in Spain, and these movements of the square that develop across the world. And so the role of the artist then became a role of the activist. And in a way, here, the notion of the commons started to be much more coinciding with the institution of the social movements, really. So commons started to be aligned much more with social movements and with urban spaces, and with social movements that started to occupy urban spaces. Here, some artists developed their own brand of, let's say, activist art, and Tania Bruguera is one of them. But in a way, Tania Bruguera also represents a moment in which artists still, let's say, cling on to the institution of art and to the institution of the museum, for instance. In fact, the Office for Art Utile are now open in all the museums of the Internazionale network, so in all the major, let's say, European museums. But the issue to highlight is that artists started to have a sense that actually they had to develop a kind of practice that was completely in line with the urgencies of the time. That artists had to initiate actions that were relevant for the political urgencies of the time, and that the kind of authorship of the artist has to give a way to forms of participation and collaboration, and also that the institution, art institution, has to change. And so instead of, let's say, art organization, you had to found parties of migrant organizations. And so that's what actually she did. But the other issue is that this is the moment in which, that Ye McKee described also as a strike art. So this is the moment in which artists decide to become activists and become actively engaged in cities, especially in urban politics. 2010 is also the moment in which, let's say, there is a convergence across the world of urban struggles, in the sense that there is a movement in Latin America that is very strong, that comes from the favelas, that come from the slums, comes from Latin America, which is very influential for the kind of urban politics that in Europe then would develop precisely in 2010. In Latin America starts much early on. And so there's this movement of reclaiming the city, right to the city. And in 2008 and 2010, European organizations, European social movements also start to reclaim cities. And this is a moment that you might remember that David Harvey writes the book Rebel Cities, precisely a book that it's, draws on the experience of Teatro Valle, where David Harvey and David Graeber were spending a lot of time trying to understand what was going on in these new movements of urban commons. So Teatro Valle is still, but it's a kind of domesticated version of what it was in 2011. Was a theater that was open in the 18th century. It was the first public theater in Rome, even if it was very beautiful. And in 2011, the municipality threatened the space for closure, and the artists of the theater occupied the space. And that was the first really moment in which lawyers started to think ways in which occupation could be legalized. And effectively, there was a new, let's say, juridical structure that was created for occupied space in Italy. And so these occupied spaces were legalized, and not only they were legalized, but this is the Asilo Filangieri in Naples that was occupied 1 year later. And this is a wonderful monastery in the center of Naples, completely restructured, where the municipality, this is the theater and the chapel that is turned into a kind of a space for conversation and workshops, where actually the municipality gives an income to the space for the kind of the work that the space provided to the community. So these moments of urban commoning was also a particular moment in relationship to institutional change. It was the moment that Claire Bishop described as a radical museology. So it was a moment in which also museums open up to social movements. As you probably know already, MACBA, under the direction of Manolo Borja Villel, started to support very strong social movement linked to Podemos in Barcelona, but also new forms of pedagogy, new schools that were completely deregulated. So this is a movement of, let's say, institutional opening in which both municipalities and museums start to open up to commons. And there is this kind of conversation, institutional conversation between commons and institutions, and kind of traditional institutions of the museum and also traditional municipalities. And so at that time, it was precisely the time in which I was directing the Biennale, and that's what I tried to experiment with this edition of the Biennale, which was the Biennale where also Documenta was in town under the title Learning from Athens. Bagion was a huge hotel that was completely disbanded when we got it, and in the center of Athens, but it's a kind of in the commercial center of Athens. It was covered by a market, so it was very difficult to access it. And let's say that when I started the Biennale, the first thing that I did was to connect with all these organizations I was describing at the beginning of this conversation. So all these kind of self-run television, newspapers, squads, cooperatives, hackers that were actually growing in Athens and also in Greece, because the hackers movement was becoming very strong, especially in terms of developing this kind of blockchain currencies, because it was a time when actually the left-wing government in Syriza was considering leaving Europe and develop its own currency. So it was also an interesting moment in which the government was working with hackers to develop this form of blockchain currencies that were completely independent from Europe. So there was this kind of really important connection between the national government, the squads, and the Biennale wanted to tap into that moments of let's say, institutional collaboration. And so we invited, first we mapped for nearly 1 year all this organization, and then we invited the organization, some artists collective to stay permanently in the Bagyon, and other artists collective to gather in a general assembly which should basically set up the programs for the Biennale. So the thing that we try to do is to actually invert the mechanism of the Biennale. Rather than having a budget to commission artists to produce work, we actually, for an audience that we didn't know, we actually invited the audience, we invited the collectivity we wanted to collaborate with us, to produce a kind of direction also for the workers to work with. We invited artists that were willing to work with that process. I mean, one of them was Suzanne Lacey, but there were also other artists that were working in the cooperative movements, especially in terms of housing cooperatives. I mean, one of the basic issues, the Biennale didn't have any money, and so that in order to survive, we really had to learn from all these groups that were self-sustaining. Let's say that the experiment failed. I don't want to go into details of why. But one of the reasons was that actually this institutional opening between museums and a social organization, between municipality and social organization had broken. The kind of porosity between commons, states, and museum had broken. And had broken because in 2016 and 2017, there was obviously already, in terms of global political economy, a huge crisis that was hitting the world. And there was, the kind of commodity crisis. And so the borders closed again. Austerity came back again. Nationalism came back again. And this kind of, let's say, institutional porosity between these different spaces disappeared. And so this is a moment of conflict, of new conflict, of moments in which social movements like decolonized displays, of course, Black Lives Matter in 2013, brought the issue also of, whether these forms of commoning can exist really on a planetary level. And so all these failures of also these political movements that I'm describing are also failures of the West, or failures of the global north, especially of the left of the global north, to understand that there is no form of commoning that can exist without being planetary. There is no form of post-industrial economy. There is no form of immaterial economy. There is no end of the working class in the global north, because there is a working class in the global south. There is an industrial economy in the global south. There is extractivism in the global south. So the failure of these urban movements were really a failure to connect to different classes, to different languages, and especially to the failure to connect to the global south. And of course, that was what Documenta intuited very, very quickly, the fact that learning from Athens was already a way of turning Athens and Greece into a sort of a domestic global south. But of course now, even more so, with the latest version, it's a form of basically reproducing the global south, the structure of the Indonesian lumbung inside the hierarchy of the Athens organization. But what I wanted to highlight is that actually forms of, let's say, struggle for the commons are becoming much more conflictual and are becoming much more clear about the kinds of demands that are made from mainstream institutions. Abolitionism, as the decolonized displays introduced it, is a really important movement, not only to reimagine museums, but also to reimagine other organizations such as universities, as well as police structures. But yes, so artists trying to reimagine the role of art, the role of the global south. It's very difficult actually to do this seriously. Some, as Renzo Martins, think that you can operate as an NGO, and some, like, in a way, this strategy is very similar to the one of T.S. the Gate. The idea is that how do you hack an economy, a capitalist economy? You render it circular, but also you try to, let's say, incorporate communities that are not, let's say, within the art world. I want to talk very quickly about the Institute of Radical Imagination, which is really an organization that I set up precisely to try to counter the moment of institutional closure that I was experiencing with the Athens Biennale in 2016. And this is a collective of curators, of museums, and of scholars and activists that, let's say, whose main idea is to foster a transition into post-capitalism. Post-capitalism being, we can discuss it later. What do we mean by post-capitalism? But let's say that, yes, let's discuss it now. So post-capitalism, you can see in two ways, and these are the two ways in which we operate. One is a form of, let's say, policies that we can implement, and policies and also campaigns that we can implement in order to transition into let's say, a non-capitalist society. And these policies, we know them, and actually some of these policies were seriously considered after the pandemic. There were universal basic income, forms of demonetization of the economy, so this kind of blockchain currencies that are basically community currencies, form of decentralized autonomous organizations, which is this form, again, blockchain-based communities that have also implicit in them some mechanism of quadratic voting, so forms of voting that are much more representatives. Of course, cooperativism, forms of legalization of squats and commons, and also forms of radical care, which again we have been knowing quite a lot from the post-pandemic period. But so, as an Institute of Radical Imagination, there are lots of lawyers that have been working in Teatro Valle, for instance, with various squads. There are a lot of these historical organizations, historical artist squads and artist-run spaces that are also part of the collective. And there are some of these kind of radical museums too, such as Reina Sofia, who is operating with us. But the other issue is also the idea of post-capitalism as, let's say, a different kinds of understanding of political economy, in the sense that, of Gibson Graham, that we, as economists, and actually I have a background in economics first, then in anthropology and in art, we know that first when we talk about economy, we have to talk about planetary economy. And so, the forms of capitalism are very varied, and in fact, capitalism is only a small fraction of the institutional arrangements that are across the world. But also that we also live in a world that it's strongly entangled, where capitalism is strongly entangled with commons. And so part of the, let's say, activities of the Institute is also to generate some kind of visual production, some kind of performances that also allow us to understand or to, envision or to prefigure what it is that the world would look like in a condition of post-capitalism. To make an example, one of the things that we do, we work on universal basic income through, long sort of durational research and interviews, and then we generate this kind of public conversation or public dialogues that are performed in public, sometimes in museums. But also as anthropologist, I'm working on a very long-term project on universal basic income. The issue is, the universal basic income is another very controversial issue because it's not about the economy. It's about whether we can imagine a future without work. What does it mean, a future without work? What will we do without working? And how would it survive? This is basically what the architects of the universal basic income don't think about. it's not only about redistributing money, it's also, what kind of system you have once you don't work. And so the other thing is to try to imagine also, as Simon was saying, a political space that is, let's say, planetary. There is transhistorical, there is transgeographical. What does it mean to imagine a space in between, really, this kind of, let's say, spaces between the global north and the global south that I was highlighting? What does it mean to imagine a commons without the kind of Western or ethnocentric frame of understanding? And one of the things that we did, just to let's say maybe conclude, was to the other thing about the Institute actually is that there were several problems that the Institute as an institution, as alter institution, wanted to address. One was, of course, geographical, because the Institute is present in various parts of the world, especially the Mediterranean. So we're present in Milan, Venice, Athens, Istanbul, Cairo, St. Petersburg, and so we are, kind of migrating between these poles, and especially the idea was to create a zone between Europe and the Mediterranean that would be an alternative to Western Europe. And the other issue was that the Institute wanted to operate as a kind of threshold institution between museums, let's say, spaces of knowledge production, and activist organization. So that's why all these organizations are contained in the Institute, because we try to facilitate the kind of relationship between commons and governments, between commons and museums that are not possible anymore. Because if a public museum now supports the social movements in Spain, they're closed the day, from one day to another. So the Institute operates that kind of transition kind of invisibly. And the other issue is really about temporality, the temporality of art institution, but institution in general, in the sense that whenever people like Tania Bruguera talks about timely or politically timely art, art that has to address this kind of urgency. In a way, what is forgotten is that the kind of the emergence of the event, of the political event, is already the consequences of structural factors, often planetary, ecological factors that are already changing. And so how you address a political urgency in the moment without actually reproducing the same temporality of capitalism, with the same temporality of the event, the same linear temporality of political revolution, how you address a temporality outside the temporality of capitalism. And so in a way, the Institute allows us also to these very long-term trajectories for our projects. The Institute is now 6 years old, but I'm hoping that the funding will not end. And next question I'm sure you will ask me is, how is it funded? And is it funded by a philanthropist who's in a board of, let's say, philanthropists and curators that are come from this generation of actually activist curators who are supporting a lot of activist organizations across the world, very serious activist organization who can survive thanks to this support. And so in a way, the kind of it's we can also talk about let's say the philanthropic structure of that support this kind of anti-institutional or alter-institutional arrangement. But one of the things that I wanted to discuss was the the project we did coinciding with the arrival of the Zapatistas to Europe last year to mark the 500 let's say, I wouldn't say celebration, but let's say date of the conquest of America. And they came not to, let's say, attack or recriminate, but they came to educate a global north that they felt was completely on the edge of crisis. And what we did with the Institute, we connected both with the Zapatista community in Chiapas, but also with a series of organizations in Madrid and in Europe that were inspired by Zapatista or were being funded by Zapatistas. So the idea was not to actually create an event in which we celebrated Zapatismo, but was a way of relating to the principle of autonomy and the principle of really commoning that Zapatista community managed to implement, following an incredible, let's say, exercise in combining Marxism with indigenous thinking, and really with combining, let's say, a different kind of version also of temporality, different version of institutional arrangements. There was this kind of a nationalistic, let's say, framework of a Mexican revolution of Zapata, but there was also this very regional and dispersed setup of indigenous communities. So what we did, we developed a series of conversation. This was the arrival of the Zapatista community in Madrid. And we called this year-long series of conversation on the precipice of time. And we developed a series of strands in collaboration with this both local Zapatista organization and with the Zapatista community, which was about pedagogy. As we know, one of the principal Zapatista communities to have a world where many worlds coexist. And people like Escobar, people like decolonial thinkers really look to the Zapatista community as a principle really of decolonial knowledge, forms of grassroots care, and of course the notion of UBI in the sense that the Zapatista collectives are basically commons where people don't work for money, but people work for the community. And particularly, I was involved in the section on cinema. Because I work on film, but also I was very interested in the way the Zapatista community developed their own aesthetics and their own politics of filmmaking in relationship to different trajectories of historical trajectory, also of relationship with, let's say, Western film technology and Western aesthetics. The one thing that we wanted to do is to highlight these two forms of filmmaking of the Zapatista community. One that was projected towards using film as a tool of a really practical communication. And so the idea was to de-aestheticize as much as possible film and to turn the film into some kind of communiques, which, as we know, are very important in the strategy of Subcomandante Marcos initially, but also Subcomandante Galeano. The idea of the communique, so the film had to be non-aesthetic, had to be a practical tool of communication. And the other side, there was also, this more backward-looking, but not backward in the sense of reactionary, this idea of looking back towards the ancestral knowledge of younger filmmakers from the indigenous community who were very interested in, let's say, maintaining the tradition, especially the tradition of healing, of ethnobotany. And so there was this soul, let's say, in the aesthetic of the Zapatista that were, linked in the notion of autonomy that we explore through this exhibition, which was also, of course, attended by the Zapatista contingent, but they also was built a series of events of screenings with the communities in Madrid, also that were sort of building to this event around political cinema and revolutionary cinema. We also created a pedagogical station with the Stodelat, which is a group of political artists Russian who are part of IRI. And so we had this moment also of, let's say, pedagogical discussion with the community to build a world where different worlds can be together. And let's say that the last thing is that in that occasion, the Zapatista community came with a lot of artwork that they knew they could sell to Reina Sofia. And we bridged this kind of negotiation between the Zapatista and Reina Sofia. And it was a really interesting process because obviously there was a total, let's say, unusual relational event where there was no art market involved, obviously no art value, And the negotiation was a kind of, let's say, reparation from Reina Sofia towards the Zapatista community, but was also, in a way, also a mechanism of appropriation that was kind of problematic in the sense that now you can find actually Zapatista artwork in Reina Sofia. And the community decided to donate the money that they got from Reina Sofia to an NGO that in Chiapas is working with migrants. And so let's say that I thought that this was a very interesting way of highlighting how this, this mechanism of solidarity can work and how you can actually transform institutional arrangement that are also problematic into forms of circular economy and solidarity. The last thing I wanted to say is that the group of IRI, the Stodela, they were based in St. Petersburg, had to leave Russia because they were closed down by the police, and they moved to Istanbul, where now a lot of, let's say, exilic communities from Russia are meeting with migrants communities, and there is a really important moments of solidarity, of coming together, especially of the artist community. And that, came back in a way to this idea of planetary politics, especially to Trotsky, because Trotsky actually went to Istanbul after he had to also leave Russia, and he kind of developed this idea of planetary politics and of permanent revolution, partly there in Istanbul on his way to Norway, but also to show that in a way there is a kind of, let's say, nomadic quality to some forms of artwork, or let's say art commons, that really look at this kind of international planetary dimension. Yeah, I would leave it here. Thank you.
Roots and places, for example, in the global south for sure, but also nowadays in the global south of Europe. And the institute that you have constructed seems to, as I understand it, be located in the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. Maybe for those reasons, maybe others, but that's actually not what I wanted to ask about, why you limit it in that way. But rather that I think we're experiencing now in this country and in London also a failed nation state. And why, if you have any opinions on that, do we not see any movements towards commoning in terms of the art institutions in London and in the UK?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think that one of the problems of Britain kind of goes back to Stuart Hall's description of Thatcherism, and how basically Thatcherism managed to capture different classes in a common vision, in a common reactionary vision. And one of these visions was a racist vision, of the white working class, this panic that Stuart Hall was highlighting, but also the endorsement of nationalism. And I felt that left-wing populism in Syriza, for instance, that I had to deal with a lot, in Podemos, and even in the UK with Corbyn, was very nationalistic in the end. So I think that the failure of the left-wing populism was to endorse nationalism and to open up actually the space for right-wing populism. And so we are completely, well, I wouldn't use a strong, but we are completely locked in the fact that the left cannot think in terms of commons anymore, or cannot think in terms of commons in the kind of articulated way in which the left in Italy managed to think about. Not because of Italy, but because there was these historical moments in which lawyers understood that the commons could be occupied and could be put in conversation with a state that was failing. There's not an understanding that the state, can actually be occupied and be put in conversation with the political movements, I think. So, yeah, that's what I experienced in the UK, and I haven't been able to actually connect to commons in London, despite I've been wanting to, and despite some of the commons actually were created also by ex-students of mine. but they say the momentum didn't create the kind of connection that was really internationalist, for instance, with migrants, with other people that were, they could have been active. That's my perception, is that the form of the nation state is still very strong in this country, and it's still very strong for the left in general,
Okay, I don't know, we have that's the roaming mic, so does anyone else have questions? Yeah, start over here.
Hi, I'm David. Sorry. Hey. Thanks for that really good talk. I just have a question on your two things. The characterization of the sort of lifestyle shifts that happened in the 70s. I like when you kind of jumped to the 90s with relational aesthetics, I kind of wish you went in that in-between space more, because I think the question that's brought up in Claire Bishop's book and essays has to do with the acknowledgement of the limitations of art in agitation. Like the difference between relational aesthetics being something that's kind of apolitical and participation is that not just that participation is explicitly dealing with the political, but also that it acknowledges the limitations of art and its instrumentalization to make political ends. So like, in participation, you have the engagement that happens with like Hirshhorn, or where he acknowledges the time limitation of what's happening, or like, I think you wrote Richard Serra, but you meant Santiago Sierra for the line. There's like a nihilism which acknowledges the lack of ability of art to do anything. Or with Paul Chan, he specifically says, oh, I'm doing something that's a project to help people, and I'm making an artwork separate, and they're very explicitly separate. So in some ways, like, do you think when you come back to fully instrumentalizing art and not seeing it as an end in itself, you sort of are back at square one with lifestyle politics? So that's my question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are two issues. First, I think Bishop is very much influenced by Chantal Mouffe and by this idea of politics as a discursive rearticulation. And if you do that, then, Stuart Hall was also very interested in that, but he also maintained a kind of foot in the material, material politics, materiality. And yeah, so I think that kind of discursive approach led to quite a cynical reading of politics and detached from class analysis. So everything really could happen in the discursive space. And that kind of approach also led to a sort of cynicism that then became very prevalent in forms of art activism. The kind of boycott, occupation, negative freedom, all these terms were very important, but also very cynical, in the sense it was the reproduction of criticality, of discursive criticality. And who could do that? Who could afford to go at a gallery and actually enjoying for prostitute or a line of tattoos? Just the middle class. Why would you want to be going to that context if you were not the middle class? So yeah, I agree with you. And somehow for me, like my entire practical attempts are to create institutions that I want to live in, that I want to engage people, projects that I want to engage people in. So for me, abolitionism is this perspective where you look at an institution and say, if I had to redo this institution, how would I want to do it? But yes, to answer to your question, I think I jumped from the 70s to the 90s quite easily, and in the 80s there were serious attempts to engage with post-capitalism or with this form of like hacking, media activism. The 80s are full of also performance artists who engage seriously with capitalism, not only in a conceptual way.
I don't see any hands.
Yeah.
Oops. Sorry. I don't know why. I was for 7 o'clock in the morning, yeah. So.
Everybody's shy today.
Don't be shy.
Okay, we have.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. Sorry for the feedback. I was curious about this UBI program that you're working on. Is my phone to that? And this post-work paradigm. Sorry. So maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one issue is about the policy, whether the policy would actually work to abolish capitalism. And a lot of people say that to give money to people that doesn't necessarily abolish wealth inequalities, but also doesn't abolish the relationship we have with money, with the commodity form, and the commodity form would still survive, let's say. But the other issue is that it's really difficult for many people to imagine themselves without work. And so for me, this is really an intervention in a kind of, kind of prefiguration of the future. And especially in Brazil, where there are a lot of issues of poverty, of gender, of course, racism. So all this projection of a future without work are heavily influenced by the positionality of who asks these questions. So yeah, I'm interested in economics also as a form of kind of sci-fi. I mean, I remember with Will Davis, we initiated a project on sci-fi economics that where also Mark Fisher wrote, the kind of economics as a kind of projection about the future. That is not about economics at all. It's about life. So in a way, I think that first the UBI doesn't work if you don't abolish money, if you don't abolish structures of power. But then it's also interesting to think about our own imagination. Like the human imagination is quite limited. So I'm interested in how people imagine a future without work. And without work means a lot of things, because you could think that work also reproductive labor. The feminist strike is about destroying work at home. And so, once you think about that, then what does it mean a future without work? Where is this work taking place? So I'm really interested as an anthropologist, let's say, of political economy, to use that insight too. But the project of UBI is very problematic, and it's not really clear who is interested to push it forward. There are also stockbrokers who are supporting it. And we are supporting a pilot for the art community in IRI, Institute of Radical Imagination, and of course it works really well for the art sector because it's a very precarious sector. But there are kind of feminist economics like Kathy Weeks who writes also about it. It's really, I think, it's more than about work or about the economy. So I'm interested in that really.
Thank you. So, okay. Thank you for the talk. You mentioned the Global South a few times
through the talk, but the genealogy you traced out, of course, is very limited, North Atlantic, and somewhat canonical as well. So I was wondering, just whether you could say a bit more about the how the approach you're taking up. It's partly to do with just please speak more about the Global South and so on, but I think what I'm really interested in is the notion of planetarity that Simon introduced the series with, which I know is his version of what the talk is about and not necessarily your version of what the talk is about. But I guess what I was interested in was that the examples you gave are on the one hand extremely specific and localized, and they have to be because of the kind of communities you're dealing with, but you're also kind of presenting a somewhat planetary picture of factionalism. And so what's the transmission mechanism between these different initiatives? What's the kind of platform communication? That's the general question. And then specifically, I'd be interested to hear a bit more of your take on the Run Group documentary. Because that seemed to be a moment which tried to make some of the same sorts of claims that you were proposing. You kind of mentioned it very quickly in passing. It seemed like you were saying this was a way for big institutions to incorporate the kind of initiatives that you're talking about. How else does it happen on the kind of scale of planetary visibility and ways that connect and network these different localized moments to one another and visible externally at a large enough scale? That's my first question.
Thank you.
And also my other question.
So I mean, every time you structure a narrative in the way I structure, obviously you are reproducing a certain Western canon. So I'm, even the notion of history of art is a Western notion. So in a way, it's a kind of rhetorical, let's say, mechanism that I use. But to me, the kind of movements of art and commons that I'm interested also in the book start with the 70s. And especially my interest is in the relationship between politics in Latin America and European politics, because I've been doing research in Latin America. So it's again in Brazil, so again it's very specific to a kind of a specific trajectory that is not, for instance, dealing with the non-aligned movements or dealing with the movements only peripherically. I'm more interested in this kind of really forms of urban politics that rely on commons or common public spaces, let's say. So I don't deal with let's say the international solidarities as they came about in the Third World movements because this is the kind of angle that I have. It's very specifically historical from the 1970s, and specifically my entering is on this form of urban struggles, let's say, from the Global South, and then were incorporated in Europe. By people like, Iglesias, who went to Brazil and were inspired by the participatory budget. So I'm kind of tracing a specific genealogy, let's say, of Global South, which is limited, but that's the genealogy I'm kind of interested in, and I've been looking at the connection, let's say, that I've been looking at. Not more generalistic, but more specific on this kind of urban politics, let's say. And it's very geographical, also geographically based, and it's also linked to the history of slums and this kind of formation within a specific kind of political economy that I've also been studying because I've been looking at industrialization in Brazil. So there is a real connection between dependent development and forms of urbanization that then generate social movements with a specific focus on socializing the city. So that's where I'm coming in, and I know it's limited, but I think it's very interesting also to understand how this bouncing back of political strategies and political imagination has happened between Latin America and Europe, and continue to happen in a way, both in authoritarian and non-authoritarian fields, let's say. Then my other take on the South is kind of skeptical in the way that a lot of this idea of the South as a space of, let's say, coming together of informal politics, of this kind of non-institutional political forces, as was discussed by Nina Montman, by Juan Gaetan, this idea of the South as being this kind of space of anti-state or anti-party, where there was this kind of fluid politics. I think that led to the then valorization of artist spaces in the Global South. They were also quite detached by everyday politics. Some because they were middle class groups. They were, yes, decolonial, but they were also middle class. They didn't connect to slums or favelas in an active way. And I don't want to pass judgment on one group, but you know, one of the comments about the collective is that it's not very connected to class politics or to the kind of everyday politics of the context where they operate. But again, let's say that my focus is really kind of more an autoethnography of the way the West constructs its visions of the South. And of course, I have experience of art organization in Brazil, so there could be another discussion. There's another, let's say, genealogy. Yeah, in terms of documenta, you know, you can see that there are many interesting things in relationship to the temporality, for instance, the geography, as you were saying. This is a mechanism that has been, and that is continue to undermine the logic of documenta, because economically the effect of this kind of dispersion and socialization of resources will be long term. There are initiatives that will last for long term, for a long time. There is an attempt to relocalize a lot of the money and activities back to, you know, Indonesia and Jakarta, and to create international networks. To me, it's not very clear if this is a kind of socialization of an institutional space, or is an institutionalization of a social space. It's not clear really. And you know, there are people like Cuba, and who's trying to map the economy of Documenta, and I'm sure that you also have an idea of the economy. You know, this massive budget that effectively was redistributed quite a lot to many organizations. I know also several artists who have been not paid, who are kind of self-funded. And so some of these artists are middle class, and so maybe it's a social redistribution, I don't know. But I'm not really sure about that. I mean, Simon and you probably know more about it. The mechanism is certainly the same mechanism of finance. So it's a Ponzi schemes that works the other way. You know, that works to socialize capitalism rather than capitalize society as a real Ponzi scheme would work. But the scheme is that one, you know, that you expand and expand and expand. And so I don't know really enough to understand if that's really a logic of the Global South. It's really a logic of the Lumbung. And my other point that is, as anthropologists, is also to try to overcome the geography of what we mean by Global North and Global South, at the same time in which recognizing that there is a very strong history of violence and exploitation that is very geographically based, but it's also, this notion of the commons is also a way to de-essentialize also geographically where these forms of common or communism happen. So perhaps my lack of also geographical specificity, it also comes from this understanding that there is a periphery of Europe, there is as global south as another global south, but at the same time to maintain the differences, otherwise we end up as like Documenta, where Greece becomes a marker of the global south. So yeah, I guess the global south comes into play in a very specific way. That is probably very specific to my vision and doesn't acknowledge that long history of resistance of communism, of anti-capitalism that brought together different nations in the global south. I don't know if I don't know. I mean, I'm curious to know what you think about the Lumbung and about Documenta, because it impress you.
I didn't see it.
Oh, I can. So I think
Yeah.
it's just to use some of the terms that have come up. I think it's very, to me, it's regardless of all sort of other issues. Analytically, I would say it's a really good example of institutional disparity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And the reasons for that has, of course, to do with the economic distribution, the social distribution, but also with the way that the global south in the Western art world is not a space, it's an image.
Mm-hmm.
And here, it tried to turn that image into a space of socialization on the stage, the theater stage was Documenta.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the fallout of that is that is not possible. And then we can say whether that's not possible due to German racism, which is one factor, or it's not possible due to lack of professionalization, consciously or subconsciously, from one group.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't really matter in a structural sense of it being a classic example of institutional disparity, that the institution of Documenta that tries to be a world exhibition in different ways cannot accept that someone who is not Western persists their point of view as universal.
Mm-hmm.
The only universalism that we can accept and criticize is the Western. So if someone tries to actually universalize from, let's say, the global south, that leads to this complete short circuit of the representational system of the Western art world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all for today. Yeah, with that.
Joyful conclusion.
And is there a MFA bar downstairs, upstairs? Yeah. All right. So hope to see some of you there.
Thank you.